Happy Tuesday, everybody. It's been a little bit since we did this, but I like to do these community deck techs where we have people submit their own brews, their own lists, and to get some feedback from the community and myself. So we had 7 submissions this week, and could only get through 4. So sorry to those that didn't get covered. That's just the way it goes. And if you want to talk separately about my thoughts on your deck, you can always hit me up, especially if you're a YouTube member. That's what it's all about, right? So this one was Mono White Poison by Red Helix, and first thing I do is look at the lands, make sure that they look about right. I think 23 lands is about right for this sort of curve. You don't have any 4 drops, but you do have a fair amount of 3, right? And I think you could probably get away with 22 if you wanted to, right? You could probably push it in that direction. You have enough untapped white sources with the 18 planes to play everything in your curve on the turn that you want to. And so really this one is going to be more about cards that I usually see in this archetype that aren't in this list, just for your consideration. You may have already considered them. And the other thing too is just to kind of showcase off the deck, right? So we had a Celestia or a Bant kind of toxic deck that went away during rotation. And this is the white core of the Celestia toxic deck, but has the Enduring Innocence from Duskmourn, which allows you to draw cards and refuel, right? We also have the Sheltered by Ghosts to improve the matchup against mono red, where the toxic strategy kind of was weak against it. Toxic strategies tend to punish the life gaining decks, right? Anything that is afraid of the poison counters eventually winning the game. And we also have the split up in here, and this is the one that I think is questionable. I'm not 100% convinced on this, because your Sheltered by Ghosts gets wiped by the split up. Not necessarily, but you kind of have to work around it. And then same thing with the Annex Sentry, right? So the board wipe, I get why you want the board wipe against something like Mono Red or Boros Prowess, or any of the board flood strategies, but you yourself are a board flood strategy with the Skrelv's Hive, right? So generally I see this, I don't usually see split up in this archetype. Usually I see something like the Destroy Evil, Lay Down Arms, or Ossification, right? You did bump up Get Lost too. I don't usually see a full play set of this, but I think this is fine. You could play something like the Ossification over it if you had more of a enchantment synergies, right? And ultimately I think it's about fine. Kutzel's Flanker is included in some lists just for a little bit of graveyard hate, and again, stabilization against mono red, which tends to be a tough matchup. But because you're bringing in the Sheltered by Ghosts, I think you already have enough tools that you don't really need the Kutzel's Flanker, but something to explore. And then the Dollmaker's Shop is another one that I've seen paired with the go wide strategy of the Skrelv's Hive, that may be worth bringing in as one of, or maybe just instead of the split ups. You could play around with it. I think Dollmaker's Shop kind of makes sense, but certainly not necessarily just across the board better. Again, the other thing that I tried to stress during these things is that Magic the Gathering is about pros and cons. So obviously running split up is going to be better in some matches compared to the single point interaction that would be good in others. So thank you for the submission. Second one here is Dimir Faeries by Rylith6. And that previous list, I can't remember if I said it, it was Mono White Poison by Red Helix. And so Dimir Faeries by Rylith6. Again, we're going to start with the lands. So right now you're running 22, I think. Yeah, 22 lands. And I think that's a little bit on the low side. And especially because I think that generally I want to see more copies of Enduring Curiosity, at least 3, just because I feel like it's one of the stronger cards in this list, right? If not 4, right? And then the more 4 drops that you're going to bring in, then the more you definitely want to be higher than 22 lands. The only thing that's really giving you the making it even slightly okay to be on such a low land count is because of like your looting abilities off of Talion's Messenger. And usually I don't even count that because you really want to count your 1 drop and your 2 drop, or sorry, your 1 mana value and your 2 mana value card draw as far as like what allows you to shave lands. And so there's some mana issues that I have with this deck, right? So the other issue, other than it being just a low land count in general, is that there are 13 sources of black, and a card like Fairy Dream Thief needs 14 untapped sources. And then furthermore, 11 of those sources are for non-creature. So if you're going to do like a turn 1 Duress, or its replacement Ego Drain, then you're going to want to get this number up to 14, and that's for non-creatures specifically, so it doesn't include the Cavern of the Souls, right? Or Cavern of Souls. And then, so it's 9 sources of black for a turn 1 black spell. So you're not doing a Fairy Dream Thief, you're not doing a turn 1 Duress, right? Currently, at least not 90% of the time. And I'd like to change that. So as far as blue goes, you've got 14 sources of blue, and it's a little bit light on things if you do want to cast like Kaido on turn 3. That's not happening. You would need 18 sources of blue for that, and that's why that double pip blue is typically reserved for like mono blue decks. And then you need 16 if you want to cast the Enduring Curiosity on turn 4 90% of the time to have the 2 CC, the 2 double pip. So a little bit stretched there. 14, this is going to be a little bit more like turn 5 or turn 6 where you can then consistently hit it. So I would stress trying to get less of the just 15 basics if you're going to play in Dimir, to make it a little bit better, more consistent. And the other thing too is I think that Rogue's Passage seems a little bit out of place here because your fairies are already flyers and have a lot of evasion built in with the flying. It does help your Enduring Curiosity get through on the ground, but it's not necessary for the archetype because you can kind of just clear the way with your removal, fairy fencing, go for the throat, etc. Right? And so what I would like to see is probably Rogue's Passage removed. If you do want to keep a colorless land, which I think you can, especially if you bring in some of the alternatives like Gloomlake Verge, Restless Reef, Underground River. Soulstone Sanctuary is any creature type, so it works as a fairy, right? And I think it could work particularly well with your fairy theme. Now, Stasis Field is definitely a whiff in my book. One, it doesn't work with the Picklock Prankster, which hits instant sorcery or fairy cards. So having the removal in the form of an enchantment doesn't really do a lot for this deck. And then you also, a typical fairy that's included in the Dimir Faeries list is Halo Forager, and or at least as a sideboard in Best of 3. And this also allows you to hit instances and sorceries, so it would be a non-bow with the Stasis Field if you went further down that road. And so I get that, like, the appeal to it, I guess, is you can remove something like the Heartfire Hero without taking damage, and you can kind of just like leave it there, but it's a little bit expensive, and I would rather just use something like Cut Down and take the 1 damage, or use something like Stab if you're really worried about it too much. So unless I'm missing something entirely about why the Stasis Field is in here, I think there's much better options in blue and black, right? Or in black especially. And bringing something in like Cut Down especially would work with the Halo Forager and the Picklock Prankster, creating that into more likely to hit something off of the top. And then I'm not a big fan of Patchwork Banner in decks that aren't going wide, right? So if you're doing something where, like, if you play a creature on turn 1, a creature on turn 2, on turn 3, this is coming down as a 2/2 worth of stats for 3, which is bad tempo, right? So then you need to make it up, right? Like if you play a 3rd creature, now it's a 3/3 for 3 and it's even. You play a 4th creature, now it's a 4/4 for 3 and it's a little bit better, right? So if you play something that's like a 1-drop into Resolute Reinforcements, which is 2 bodies, then it can come down as a 3/3 on turn 3 and it's a little bit less tempo negative, right? And especially since this list isn't really doing much with the low land count, to run 2 mana rocks is puzzling to me. So personally, I wouldn't be on the Patchwork banner. I don't think it works particularly well. I get that it is a tribal deck or a typal deck, where you can focus on giving all of your fairies +1/+1, and maybe I'm undervaluing it a little bit, but I've been unimpressed with it, even in very, very typal decks like Boros Mice, for example, or Mono Black Skeletons. And some people still like to run it, so maybe I can't convince you otherwise. The other part too here is so because Kaido, so one double pit blue is so difficult to cast, this is actually a lot easier to fit into your curve than the double pit blue is. And I think it's actually a better version of Kaido, right? I think this one works better in what you're trying to achieve with your evasive flyers. And you don't have something that is like the perfect target for it because you're not running like the Spyglass Siren, but you still have like Fairy Dream Thief. You get a Surveil. It's not the worst to have some sort of ninjutsu target with the Kaido Bane of Nightmares. So I would probably replace that one with the Dimir version. Just if anything, just because of the mana. The other question you have to ask yourself is, why are you doing fairies instead of like just Dimir midrange? And so you got to lean, I think, a little bit more heavily, or I want to see this deck lean more heavily into the fairy synergies, specifically Spell Stutter. I think this should just be at a full playset of 4. Same with the Picklock Prankster, the Sleep Cursed Fairy, and the Fairy Fencing, right? I think there's a lot of here that's like being explored as a 2 of. Borrow Naughty, Obira Dreaming Duelist, and Talion's Messenger have all been kind of whiffs so far from what I've seen. You can synergize Talion's Messenger with Shieldred the Apocalypse, and that might make it a little bit better to have the recurring card draw to take advantage of the loot. I know some people have explored Subterranean Schooner to increase the tempo of this deck and make your flyers into more aggressive threats. Still not with a huge amount of success in the tournament scene in Best of 3. And then Ego Drain, though, is instead of the Duress, I would like to see the Ego Drain, because this is an upside to running the fairies. If you have enough of a critical mass of fairies, which you do in this list, then Ego Drain is just a strictly better Duress because it allows you to hit creature cards as well, right? So it's less of a strong just turn 1 Ego Drain, but it doesn't look like you're trying to do a turn 1 Duress with this mana base anyway, right? So I would focus on trying to do a turn 1 Sleep Cursed Fairy and then a turn 2 Ego Drain and something else, right? Build the curve that way so that you have like 13 untapped sources for a black, and then that are specifically for non-creatures, and then you should be good to go, right? So I hope that helps, and thanks for sharing. All right, third up on the list here is Boros Human Aggro by Aldrin, and Adrin Carlo Unza 84118 or 8418. I hope I got close. Anyway, so this one is, instead of doing something like Boros Mice, this one's leaning into the human synergies and is built around the Coppercoat Vanguard. And if you remember if anybody played prior to rotation, everyone should remember Coppercoat Vanguard and Thalia in mono white humans. And I think that's where the recruitment officer is kind of piggybacking along into this, because I like the Sheltered by Ghosts. We've talked about that one a lot. It's a busted uncommon, definitely worth playing. And the Coppercoat Vanguard is as well. The recruitment officer, on the other hand, I think there's a better card for it, and that's Kellen. And the reason is because you built this deck to be majority red, so you've got 14 sources of red and 12 sources of white. And Kellen gives you the red mana sink, which kind of gives you the additional dig like the recruitment officer. And then if you're not getting to the mana sink because you are running a relatively low land count, Kellen then just acts as an easier to cast 2/1 with this current mana base. Because again, a 1-costed mana like recruitment officer wants 14 untapped sources of white, and this one has 12. So you're hurting your chances of having that 90% success rate of casting the recruitment officer on 1. Whereas with the 14 that you have as is, even with the Mishra's Foundries, you could cast the Kellen 90% of the time on turn 1. So you could make all of your turn 1 plays red. And so I feel like that one's a pretty good upgrade for this list. The other thing too is that you could, tweak the lands a little bit, like the Thran portals. if you were to take out 2 mountains and bring in 2 Thran portals, you would be able to have the same mana base, but you would have 14 untapped sources of white, and you'd have 14 untapped sources of mountains of red. So maybe bring in the Thran portal if you really want to keep the recruitment officer. And the Charming Scoundrel and Inti, I just threw them in here because they're rare humans that could be better than the Heartfire Immolator. They have different pros and cons, right? So Charming Scoundrel, the upside to Charming Scoundrel is that you can discard no cards if your hand is empty and then draw a card. And so it can give you some pressure. And then it can also help you double spell by being a 2-drop that then on turn 3 allows you to do another 2 2-drops. So it kind of depends. You do have a pretty equal split. I mean, you have an exactly equal split. It could work well for double spelling on that kind of curve out, if that makes sense. And then Inti is another one that kind of helps you with the lower land count, because I think 20 works for best of 1. In paper, I'd want 21, right? And you're on 20. So if I was playing this in paper at 20, I would want something like Inti, Cynical of the Sun, to give me that 2-costed card draw, which allows me to cut some lands and play a lower land count, right? So the filtering on Inti is particularly nice. And then it also kind of gives you this, achieves the same dig as Feldon, right? So both Charming Scoundrel and Inti could give you more dig options if you are finding yourself getting screwed on mana by going this low. Could be alternatives to Explorer, to the Heartfire Immolator. It's kind of like the Emberheart Challenger, though. I get like the Prowess has, some nice synergies with the Monstrous Rage and the double strike off of the Boros Charm. So by no means is that like Heartfire Immolator a bad card. I'm just trying to throw out some ideas. And then Dreadmaw's Ire and Turn Inside Out. You could replace the Felonious Rage with Turn Inside Out is 1 more damage, 2 more damage if you're dealing with the double strike with the Boros Charm. The other side of bringing in the Kellen is that you have another route to the double strike outside of the Boros Charm. So might be worth bringing in something like that. And then the Dreadmaw's Ire gives you trample, right? And you've got Monstrous Rage here, but no other real, no other Might of the Meek or anything like that that's going to help you get your trample damage through. So I think this deck is a little prone to getting chump blocked some of the time, which then the Dreadmaw's Ire could help if that is the case, right? The upside to the Felonious Rage is being able to double, to hit something like the Immolator and immediately give it haste. And with the 20 lands, I'd have to play this deck myself to see how often I'm able to actually play the Felonious Rage on turn 3 after a 2-drop. For me to be convinced that it's better than the Turn Inside Out or the Dreadmaw's Ire. So it's just something to think about. And the last one we're going to cover today is Jeskai Oculus, and I should be able to get to these community deck techs more often, so look for the bat signal, and I will let you all know when the next one is happening when I can in the videos. It won't be every week. I think it'll probably be closer to every other week, but it's been like a month or more, right? Since I think it's actually been a month and a half since we did these last. So anyway, there should be a little faster turnover if you want to resubmit your deck if you didn't get picked, and etc., right? So this one is our one and only best of 3 list, and best of 3 lists are welcome. I'm assuming that it's a best of 3 list because it has a full sideboard. And I sat here and I tried to improve upon this deck, and I came up with like a couple of nitpicky things, some that are just like really not that important. So well done. I like the direction that you took it. So this one's 22 lands, which seems about right. I think you could probably get away with 21, even in paper or even in best of 3. That is if your mana base allowed you to, right? And you're maximizing your mana base, and it is amazing. The more that I sat down and was like, well, wait, what about this? What about this? You are hitting the numbers spot on for what you need to, right? So you have the 2 tap sources of the Thundering Falls, but that gives you 14 untapped sources for the Spyglass Siren. And the one downside is that you have 12 sources of white, which makes it unlikely that you're going to do a turn 2 recommission. But because the deck isn't really doing any you know, the only time that you would do a turn 2 recommission is off of the Thundering Falls, surveilling an Abhorrent Oculus into your graveyard on turn 1, followed by the recommission. And it's such like a tiny amount that I don't think it's particularly important. But you could, if you really wanted to increase your chances, and I don't think hurt the deck too much. Like, again, this is like a, you know, a grain of salt, would be to replace the 1 Thundering Falls with an Elegant Parlor, which is the red-white version that does the Surveil, because that would give you 13 untapped sources on turn 2 to be able to hit the recommission a little bit more consistently without tweaking the overall count of the deck as far as like untapped sources go on blue on turn 1. So it's something to consider, since that was basically all I could think about. The other thing is, I'm sure you know this, 0 basics is dangerous against cards like Demolition Field. So if you weren't in such a strict space, I'd recommend getting like at least 1 basic of each color, or maybe at least blue and red, one island and 1 mountain in here, just so that you have something, so that Demolition Field isn't just straight up a Stone Rain, because that can really hurt, right? I don't know how often you're bumping into that, but yeah, could be an issue. I don't think you actually need the Helping Hand and the recommission until turn 3 or turn 4. So I think you could squeeze, like, the Darker Wastes could just be 2 islands, right? And like you'd have 10. Yeah, I mean, it depends on how far you'd have to push. I haven't piloted the deck, so I don't know what your average casting time for the recommission is of what turn. But you might want to consider that, right? Kicking the can down the road a little bit on the Helping Hand recommission, using it as like more of a mid-range strategy. Because this deck takes a little bit of time to get going, right? It's not doing the Picklock Prankster. It's not just trying to like turbo mill into the Abhorrent Oculus and the Hadi Jin, and is instead relying on the looting mechanisms of Fear of Missing Out and Inti and Case of the Crimson Pulse and Malcolm to choose the cards that we're drawing and discarding into the deck. And I thought for a little while, I was like, okay, well, why do you have the Spyglass Siren? You're not really getting ninjutsu value out of it. Like, what's it doing? And then I was like, oh, well, it's giving you that like early evasive attacker, right? Whenever you attack, it triggers the discard off of Inti. And then just like I said, the more that I like looked into this deck and thought about like, what about this and what about this, it just kept being like, no, this is better. I like it this way. So the last one that I would tweak is 1 recommission, especially if you take my advice of taking the Elegant Parlor. Bring the recommission up to 3, because you then have 7 sorceries for your Delirium for Fear of Missing Out. And I think you can bring in the recommission instead of a Shore Up. Typically we see the Shore Ups running only as a 1-of anyway, because they can be a little bit lackluster, right? They're always a 1-for-1. I guess not always. Sometimes they're more than a 1-for-1, but usually they're a 1-for-1 or worse, right? And so I think that I would be tempted to get the 3rd copy of the recommission in over the Shore Up. And yeah. So and then sideboard. Your sideboard looks good. I think that it's a pretty it's not missing any key cards in my opinion. Personally, I'd probably be on the Authority of Consuls over the Sheltered by Ghosts. They're both enchantments for your Delirium count, but the Authority of the Consuls I feel like is a little bit better against the other Urabrask's Forge than the Sheltered by Ghosts. So again, not straight up across the board for most matchups. Sheltered by Ghosts and Authority of the Consuls are relatively comparable, but I think that would be one that I personally would change. And then the last one is oh no, that's it. Other than Kaido is going to be kind of hard to cast, but you know that. So anyway, thank you there, La Rochelle. Thank you for the Jeskai Oculus is what I decided to call your deck. I have no idea if that's right. Anyway, thank you so much for being part of the community, everybody, and for submitting your decks. And again, if this is something that you would like to do for your own build, look for the next time that I post the community deck tech for, I think, probably week 10. We'll see. Kind of have to go off of my schedule. So take care, everybody. Good luck crushing it in your RCQs and on the ladder. And I will catch you all on Sunday for some meta breakers. Take care.